This workshop is being put on by Craig Kalaji with San Pasqual Valley Soils. And Craig is not only a colleague of mine, but he's become a good friend. And he is definitely the person that I go to when I have questions about compost or carbon and all sorts of questions with low impact development and how to make that work. And so he is definitely an expert in this. And so, Craig, why don't you tell us a little bit more about yourself, about the company you work for, and then the hour is all yours.
Cool. Thank you, John, and welcome everybody. I'm really excited to share a little bit about what I've learned over the many years I've worked with basically soil organic matter and carbon in the environment, and it's a big topic. My background is I got a master's doctorate from the University of California in plant pathology, ended up working in agriculture, and then at some point in my career, I ended up working in stormwater management with compost-based best management practices, and eventually led me to working for a composting facility here in San Diego County in Escondido, right next to Safari Park. In fact, we compost all the zoo waste from the San Diego Zoo, both in the city and Safari Park, and we use it on our own fields. I'm affiliated with the last remaining dairy left in all of San Diego County, the Frank Conine Dairy. And we got started in the compost business over 16 years ago by composting our cow manure. And it's become really one of the go-to products for the organic farming industry here in San Diego County, which is one of the largest in the United States. But my job here as the Business Development and Sustainability Manager for San Pasqual Valley Soils is to actually consult with and help people understand how to utilize all these different forms of carbon. And we're going to talk about it. I'm going to start by kind of explaining just what carbon is in our environment. It's a fascinating topic, and one that's really, really getting a lot of attention as we battle and try to stabilize the climate change that's occurring because we've created an imbalance of carbon into the environment, into the atmosphere. Now, our atmosphere is stable, but what you're going to find out with various elements like carbon, they're not, and they move around a lot. So let's get started. And the topic is the soil carbon stormwater management connection and how those two are related. So let me go to the next slide here. Let's see here. Oh, there we go. Sorry. All right. Nature works through cycling. Okay. Every change is ever changing, and it is definitely influenced by man. And as I said, our atmosphere is relatively stable. Our atmosphere is made up of 78% nitrogen, believe it or not, oxygen about 21%, and then argon makes up the rest, which is just a shy 99.6% of the atmosphere of those three elements. So what makes up that less than 1%? Well, that's carbon and all the other gases in our environment, if you can believe it. It's a very small part of actually the air that we depend upon for our very life. And as such, these elements, nitrogen, carbon, water, H2O, phosphorus, all these they're constantly in flux and moving. So the carbon, we're going to talk today about the carbon cycle because it's why we got ourselves in the situation we're in today with climate change and unpredictable weather patterns. The Earth is a closed system. The amount of carbon in our planet remains the same, believe it or not. And this means that wherever carbon is located, whether that's in the atmosphere or for the most part in our soils, it's in a constant state of movement from place to place. Now, this carbon is stored in a range of different, we'll call them reservoirs, okay, such as within plants and soil microorganisms. Carbon moves between them through a variety of processes, such as through the photosynthesis and microbial reproduction and predation and parasitism. This movement of carbon between the reservoirs is what we refer to as the carbon cycle. Now, why is it important to pay attention to these cycles? Because when they get out of balance, things become rather interesting and very, very unpredictable. And they, as we are well aware, all we have to do is listen to the news, global news particularly, and realize that we're dealing with some changes in our environment that we have never seen before. And all the best scientists on the planet, and if you want to get into the topic of global climate change, NASA has a great website you can go to, but it's all about balance, because this balance helps regulate our Earth's temperature, which influences our climate and the movement of moisture and everything in the atmosphere. It makes all living life possible, including soil life. So carbon is the very essence of life on this planet, even though it represents in our atmosphere, like I said, 0.4% of the total. It is a key element in the food that sustains us. It provides a key source of energy that fuels our economy, and it impacts the movement, storage, and quality of stormwater on Earth. Now, I'll repeat that again. It impacts the movement, storage, and quality of stormwater on Earth. How many of you have ever heard that from a stormwater management class? So our lack of attention to the substantial buildup of carbon and other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere is trapping the heat, and it is contributing to a change in our climate. So let's go to the next one. So where these reservoirs we talk about, one of the ones that typically come to mind for most people are organic material. And that which is anything that was once alive constitutes an organic material. Organic, in this case, means once having been alive, and since all living things depend on carbon, that is a real important material to pay attention to. It always contains carbon. It contains also various other elements. Carbon has this unique quality, and the reason why it is so essential to life is everything attaches to it. For those of you who have ever had the opportunity to take a class in organic chemistry, it's all about all the other things that carbon does when it partners with other elements like nitrogen, phosphorus, oxygen, hydrogen, all the minors. It's really an amazing, amazing element. So carbon and nitrogen are two of those elements, that relationship between carbon and nitrogen. We're going to talk about a little later in the presentation. That's a real important one to pay attention to when we talk about organic materials. So these organic materials, or what we term as soil organic matter, is the foundation of all healthy soils. It's how we typically evaluate and say our soil is healthy. So, but what is it? Well, the soil organic matter is the digestible fraction of the soil that consists of plant and or animal tissue in various stages of breakdown or decomposition. Now, that digestibility implies that there's something doing the digesting. And that's what we're going to get to just shortly when we start talking about the life in the soil. Most of our productive soils actually have between 3 to 6% organic matter. To put that in perspective, the typical soil, native soils in California, and particularly as you get farther south into the desert areas, is less than 1%. And we'll talk about why that makes a big difference when it comes to stormwater management. So research shows that with careful management, the preservation and accumulation of the soil organic matter, what is often referred to as SOM, can help to improve soil and plant health, resulting in a higher quality and quantity of available water. So water storage, right? While rebalancing the carbon in our atmosphere. And one of the ways that storage occurs is organic matter opens that soil up and grabs a hold of that water and holds it in the soil. Now, there are a lot of different sources, as we mentioned earlier, about organic materials. The one that we're going to focus on today is compost, because it's one that we can not only manage, but it's one that we're producing in massive amounts in the state of California due to a new bill passed in 2016 called the Short-Lived Climate Pollutant Act. It was Senate Bill 1383. And Senate Bill 1383 was put into law and became effective in 2022. And it demands and mandates that every city in the state of California divert up to 75% of their organic matter from landfills to address and reduce the mitigation of methane being produced when we bury this organic matter. When we take carbon and organic matter and we bury it in a landfill in an anaerobic situation where there's lack of oxygen, we produce another compound that's carbon-based called methane. And we can actually take photographs from space and look at our landfills and see plumes of methane emitting. Well, the state of California said, we're going to be the first state that gets this problem under control. The reason methane is so damaging to the environment, CO2, which is, we have a lot of it, a lot more of it than we'd like in the atmosphere. We have to get it back into the ground where it's stored. But methane is about 48 times, and it depends on who you listen to, 25 to 48 times more potent at holding heat in our atmosphere. And so the state in its wisdom said, we've got to do our part and get that, get this planet cooled down and get that methane out of these landfills. So they passed a law saying that not only do cities have to collect all the food waste that was going to landfills and the landscape waste in every other form, paper, you name it, they also have to procure it and utilize it in a beneficial manner. And that's where stormwater management comes in. So compost, one of the reasons it's a nice product to work with when we start talking about carbon balancing is it's a quick increases are obtained with sources that are high in carbon, such as compost and semi-solid manures. So we can get a good bump in our carbon in the soil. The thing is it's relatively temporary. So we will talk a little bit about how you manage that and how you extend the storage of carbon in the environment. So you're going to get a big bump in carbon once you apply the compost, but keep in mind, remember we said earlier, carbon is cycling. So it's moving from one reservoir to another. So it's in the compost, we're applying it. And let's talk just briefly about what compost actually is when we define it. And it's a soil-like carbon-rich material that remains the remains of the decomposition of diverse organic raw materials or feedstocks. So we receive these feedstocks in the form of landscape trimmings here and also cow manure. We are the only producers, because we're the last dairy, of a cow manure compost for the organics industry in San Diego County. And then you also have feedstocks like food waste, which is going to be a major component of feedstock that will increase the amount of compost that the state has to manage and deal with. It's typically, they're good quality compost, and the ones we're looking for are typically, or always almost, produced aerobically. You can produce compost anaerobically through anaerobic digestion, but it's a different quality. So aerobic decomposition is what we're looking for. It has to be alive, rich in organic matter and organisms. And we're gonna touch on that just briefly here. Stable, slowly changing. I say stable, but I also add slowly changing, meaning compost is always in the process of breaking down, always in the process of transforming or moving from one stage to another through the activity of these microorganisms. And it's typically weed-free and pathogen-free. And we go through a process of further reduction of pathogens to achieve that by allowing thermophilic bacteria in the pile to heat the pile up to a minimum of 131 degrees and destroy pathogenic bacteria like E. coli, fecal bacteria, as well as weed seeds. So we produce a safe product that's got a lot of carbon in it and a lot of life in it. And it's variable, meaning it's typically made up of a large array of different types of feedstocks. I mentioned a few of them already. Food is a real hodgepodge of all kinds of different forms of organic material. Okay. Let's see if I can get this thing to move here. There it goes. What's in it? Well, it's a habitat, believe it or not. It's an ecosystem of bacteria, fungi, protozoa. We call it the soil food web, and it looks a little bit like this. In the soil, you have all this huge community, an entire ecosystem of life. And that food system, that food web, the food for much of the organisms, bacteria, fungi, and that is carbon. Carbon provides the energy, and these organisms live off of that as well as all the other organisms feeding on it. So it's literally a complete community of parasitism of one organism living off other organisms and benefiting some organisms and detrimental to others. And it's all taking place at a microscopic level that we can't see. It really is the livestock of soil and organic matter that does all the work for us. The bacteria, the fungi are the big contributors. Actinomycetes, what we call actinobacteria, give soil a rich soil that smell. When you think of the smell of the earth, you're typically, believe it or not, smelling these actinobacteria that have that very unique quality to them. If we bake soil, you'll notice it doesn't smell at all because you kill off all of these organisms. Compost, as I said, is the food for the microbial livestock. To give you an idea, put that in perspective, every acre of healthy soil supports enough organisms to match the weight of an average sized cow per acre foot. That's about 1,600 pounds of microorganisms for every acre foot that we farm or that we grow landscape in. In addition to feeding your crop, you must also include feeding your soil livestock. So when we harvest or we trim or we maintain our landscape and our farms, we're removing a lot of the carbon, and therefore that carbon that feeds this livestock needs to be replaced. So 1 cup of healthy soil, literally, again, another way to put this in perspective, contains 200 billion bacteria, 20 million protozoa, 60 plus miles of hyphae from fungi that extend the root system, that combine with the root system and extend it out into the soil to mine nutrients and to absorb more moisture and make that plant more drought tolerant. Nematodes, a field I'm very knowledgeable on. I did my doctorate in that field. 100,000. These are the most numerous multicellular animal on the planet Earth. Most of them exist at the scale of your eyelash. And yet they cycle a massive amount of carbon. They feed a lot of the microbiology. They're extremely important to the health of soil. And most of them are beneficial, and there are some that are pathogenic. And so, again, it's all a matter of balance. And then arthropods. So a lot going on there, and a lot of microorganisms we honestly do not see and oftentimes aren't even aware is going on. So microorganisms eat organic material. Okay, they need that carbon for energy. And they turn it into organic matter, and they derive nutrients and energy from this material, and they create compost of their own form, and they also become part of the compost. So they not only eat the carbon associated with the organisms feeding on the compost, they in turn also become part of that compost. They eat from the outside in, okay? So surface area is really important, and particle size is real important. So particle size and surface area, the smaller the particle, the more surface area. And therefore, if you have larger particles like what we call a mulch of equal volume, it will decompose slower because there will be less surface area on large particles versus the small particles. So this particle size quality of compost is really important to understand, because based on the particle size, we use the organic material and the carbon in that material differently to accomplish different things. And this is particularly true of stormwater management. So the smaller the organic particles, the more carbon cycling, okay? Soil carbon sequestration and air quality. Let's just talk about that just briefly. The soil contain a lot of carbon that plants took in from the atmosphere while they were alive. While the soil carbon sequestration really is still being studied intently at this time, and is really not completely, totally understood because of all the diversity of the life in the soil where that carbon is being sequestered or stored. In colder climates, for example, where decomposition is slower, soils can actually store or sequester this carbon for a much longer time, but not as humus. If humus, and we'll talk about what humus is in just a sec, if not for soil, this carbon would actually return back to the atmosphere where it came from as carbon dioxide, the main greenhouse gas causing the climate change that we're dealing with. So here's how this cycling's going on out there. Soil carbon sequestration or storage and air quality. Without soil amendments, you have decomposition returning some of that carbon back to the atmosphere on the left-hand side. Now you enhance that on the right side with soil amendments like compost, and in this case, you can also use biochar, although it's more expensive, and we're still doing a lot of research on that. That's basically charcoal, taking organic material under low oxygen conditions and through pyrolysis, producing a charcoal. So that's another way to store carbon. But for the most part, most of us are going to be dealing with compost. These soil amendments can lead to increased soil organic carbon, leading to carbon sequestration and enhanced soil health. So here's just a contrast with and without, and how one enhances that with the use of compost. It functions as a soil conditioner. Primarily, a good percent, almost 50% of the compost is carbon, okay? The other 50% is going to be other nutrients and other elements. It also can act as a slow-release fertilizer, but that has to be taken with a grain of salt because a lot of people think compost has a lot of nitrogen in it. And actually, it's a very, very poor supplier of nitrogen to soil and microbes. So, but it is slowly released over time. When you apply compost, your first year, you'll get maybe 20% of what's in there in terms of nutrients released. That's 80% that's still in there for year 2, 3, 4, 5. It will take years for this material to finally release all that it contains. And it contains a lot of micronutrients. And one of the things that really, really impacts is water and nutrient holding capacity. And we're going to talk about that. It also provides the energy I already talked about to provide microbes with the elements they need to survive. And they in turn contribute to plant health by producing more disease suppressive soils. They release the energy for the microbes. Also, they are part of the nutrient cycling going on. So they're doing all that work for you. And again, as I said earlier, they're suppressing diseases. Mulch on the surface gives us good erosion protection, that water conservation, and weed suppression. Water conservation, one of the big things is we need to capture more of the available water during drought periods. And one way to do that is by adding more carbon in the form of compost to our soils. If I can increase my organic matter, soil organic matter by 1% in a 1 acre foot of soil, I store an additional 16,500 gallons of water in that acre foot. That's from Michigan State's report, and it varies. Okay, it varies because of the type of soils we have. So you'll get different results, but as a general rule, you're going to store a lot of water by just 1% increase in that organic matter. So the benefits of compost use in soil, I think most of us are pretty familiar with it. It's physical, chemical, and biological. The physical, it improves that soil structure. And by improving soil structure, what I mean, it opens up the soil to absorb more of that rainfall and to hold the moisture that does fall. So moisture management, really critical to get more organic carbon into the soil. It modifies and stabilizes pH. A lot of people are always concerned about their pH, but believe it or not, composting carbon by feeding the microbes actually starts to stabilize the impact of pH and will make certain nutrients more readily available, even though our pH is maybe a little, if you will, on the high side here in the Southwest and in California, where we typically have alkaline soils, which can tie up elements like iron and magnesium and things like that. It reduces the toxic effects if you have too much aluminum, manganese, and iron in acid soils. Typically, compost will move the soil pH from either alkaline or acid towards neutral. So when you apply compost, typically you're going to, as it decomposes, it will tend to want to move everything towards a neutral status. It increases the cation exchange capacity, which many of your nutrients are in that form. And so it holds these nutrients and supplies them in a nice uniform manner. And then it binds and degrades the contaminants in the soil. Really important. That carbon, remember I said earlier, grabs a hold of a lot of things. Well, it grabs a whole lot of things that aren't so good for us and not so good for our soil. So, and soil life. Nutrient cycling is impacted biologically, supplies soil biota, meaning it just increases that life in the soil and suppresses plant diseases because of all that competition from beneficial organisms. Compost misperception. Now we're going to go through a whole series of what I call myths, if you will, that we tend to hear talked about, but oftentimes don't realize that it's a misperception. One is that it has a broad appeal because of its simplicity and versatility. This also makes composted materials prone to these myths. And the art of using compost combines both scientific knowledge with the user's experience, judgment, and intuition and ethics. First of all, here's one myth. All composts are basically the same. Compost is compost, right? And possess similar characteristics and qualities, far from the truth. The fact is that compost encompasses a wide variety of products that vary with actually what the feedstock was that produced the compost. And I also, as I talked earlier, the particle size and how we grind that material and screen it and what we use it for. And then the composting methods and how we compost. Are we composting in an open windrow? Are we composting with an aerated static pile where it's covered and we pump air into the pile? Or is it possibly through anaerobic digestion, which is a totally different type of material that's produced? Not all composts, in essence, in summary, are created equal. So you have to really pay attention to quality and what the feedstocks were that produced it. One way to do that is through participating in the U.S. Composting Council's Seal of Testing Assurance, which doesn't necessarily tell you this compost is good or bad for what you want to use it for. What it does tell you is what's in it and what the nutrient status is, whether it has pathogens in there, whether plants will germinate in soil amended with that. So it gives you transparency and visibility to the quality of the compost you're using. This is the only way. You can't guess, you got to test. And this is done on a regular basis by composting facilities who participate in the SDA program. OMRI listing for organic production is also another way, but that's a very different test, not quite as thorough as the SDA testing that is used nationally here in the United States. And most composters I work with, all of us are participants in that program. And the test results look like this, and you get a certificate, and at least you know what you're working with. And so if you're a soil biologist or scientist and you're working with a landscape or a farm, you know how the material you're applying, what you're adding to that soil. Now, carbon and nitrogen, I talked about earlier. Why is that one so important? Well, the higher the CN ratio of the compost, let's say 20:1, the greater potential for storing carbon when applied to soil. The higher the CN ratio increases the carbon storage in the soil because you have a higher percentage or ratio of carbon to nitrogen. What happens when you apply compost, not as a mulch? Oh, no, I'm sorry, this is another one. I'll get to that shortly. Compost is not a mulch, and mulch is not a compost. Compost, depending on how it's used, can be used as a plant growing media, the finer material, typically incorporated as a native soil amendment, or as a mulch. And a mulch, by definition, is simply a material, inorganic or organic, that protects the soil surface and allows air and water through. It can be composted material with fine, medium, or coarse particles, or it can be non-composted wood chips, bark, colored ground hardwood, rocks, newspaper, cardboard, even plastic. I think you get the picture, anything on the surface. So when people talk about compost and then they say, I have compost, I don't have mulch, they're actually mistaken. Mulch is anything, and compost, when used as a mulch, actually has very, very beneficial applications that can be really helpful when it comes to stormwater management. When we look at recycled carbon in the form of compost, if we look at compost as a filter media, you would look at this picture and you'd say, that's a mulch. Well, actually it is. And it can be used as such, but can also be burned and used as a biofilter. And it's designed for the movement of water through this coarse compost that will then remove a lot of the contaminants because of the carbon and the physical and biological and chemical structure of that coarse material. So this is designed for filtration and slowing down the water and absorbing contaminants. But now here's a case where fine compost was used as a mulch, not the coarser material. And the reason why is because they wanted, remember it has more surface area, you wanted to release the nutrients in there faster to the surrounding landscape ground cover and shrubs and plants. And so in this case, It's actually a very fine 3/8 inch, what you typically think of as a soil amendment, is being used as a mulch. And the nice thing about this is its ability to not only feed more quickly the plants associated with it, but also to store water. So let's go to a couple more myths here. Compost, when used as a mulch layer on bare soil to prevent water and wind erosion and conserve water and minimize weeds, should be coarse mulch with a particle size of 2 to 3, like the first picture I showed. Well, actually, when used as a mulch for stormwater erosion control, is typically the fine and medium material, 1/2 inch to 1 inch or less in size, and applied at a depth no greater than 2 inches that we use for stormwater erosion control. Fine compost retains, the reason why is fine compost retains a greater volume of water, reducing runoff. And if I reduce my runoff by absorbing more water, do I control and minimize my erosion problem? Yes. And we call that a compost erosion control blanket or a stormwater blanket. And so it's the ability of the finer material with the increased surface area to hold more water that reduces the volume. And when I reduce the volume, not only do I minimize my runoff, but I also help slow down and infiltrate that captured water that's being held in the fine material. Trick for keeping compost blankets on steep slopes. Okay, so let's say you decide you're going to use the fine compost on a slope, but it's a 2 to 1 or whatever. How are you going to keep that fine material if you get a heavy rain event? Well, what you can do, and this is where particle size understanding really comes in handy. A small amount of coarse material, let's say 10 to 20%, maybe even up to 30% of the larger 2 to 3 inch particles of compost, that 2 to 3 inch size, mixed in with the fine compost, will secure the fine material on the steep slopes. The fine material kind of filters down underneath the larger, heavier material, and that'll hold it on that hill. And it continues to support better plant nutrient availability because the fine material is now available, but you're still holding the water, the stormwater blanket on the slope with the coarse material. So think of it as a layered blanket of coarse particles on top with the settled fine compost particles on the bottom. Caltrans refers to this as their medium grade compost. It's a blend where they're getting good plant support because they want something to grow. And the nice thing about this is if you add native grass seeds to this blend, you're going to get germination. The fine material will hold the water, allow the vegetation to establish. The coarse material will hold the blanket on, and you will get vegetation, and the root system of that newly emerging vegetation will even greater stability of the soil underneath it. Provide that. So here's the fine material. We often refer to as the growing media, but it is that growing media that's designed to absorb massive amounts of water of 1 cubic foot, 12 inches by 12 inches by 12 inches of this fine material will hold 4 gallons of water. That's a lot of water. It acts like a sponge on the surface of a plant, of a soil, I should say. And the plants then can mine the nutrients faster and more quickly and get access to what's inside this fine material to support it. So here's the compost erosion control blanket with this fine material. Again, oftentimes called a stormwater blanket. By the way, up on the top of this picture, you have a compost sock with coarse material in it to slow the water down and minimize any concentrated flows that could possibly wash the fine material off. Here's a compost erosion control blanket on a slope back east. And again, they're using the fine over the coarse, oftentimes a blend. And it's all about increased water absorption and support for vegetative growth. If I can get something to grow on that slope for stormwater management, there is no better erosion control practice. Why compost erosion control practice or compost as mulch? Use fine compost over coarse. It's because of this intimate soil contact as well for optimum root growth. The very particle size of it, if you compare this to a rolled erosion control blanket, you're going to get gaps under a quar blanket or a rolled erosion control blanket. one that's a fabric material with maybe some straw blended into a plastic matrix. Here, you'll notice all those little tiny particles fill every nook and cranny and then allow that root system to stabilize what's underneath it. Here's another one. Compost is 100% organic matter. I kind of alluded to this earlier. The product contains substantial amounts of non-organic minerals and or inert compounds or components, about approximately 50%, sometimes in portions exceeding that of the organic fraction. So you can have ash, if you will, other minerals, that are present in normal soils. You're never dealing typically with 100% carbon when you deal with compost, or even when you deal with biochar for that matter. You can get biochars at a various ranges of carbon, and again, that depends on the feedstock in which they use to make the biochar and how they produce the biochar. So again, there is no one size fits all when it comes to organic carbon and these organic materials like compost. Another myth, compost is a fertilizer. Compared to conventional fertilizers, the plant nutrients in compost are actually relatively low, especially the nitrogen, but they keep giving. And so every year you apply it, the next year, guess what? You apply it again, you're getting something from the previous year and then subsequent years. So you slowly build up a reserve of nutrients that release what's in them over time. And that's really important for soil health and supporting the biology. The immediate fertilizer value is typically low, so just think of it as slow release over years, not months, but really important when it comes to supporting plant life through soil biology. Here's an example of just what we're talking about, nitrogen availability with compost. You can see year one, you had 20% of the nitrogen was released. Year two, 30, that's total. That's 10% in year two and another 20%. Year three, 35, year four. By year five, you've literally released most of the available nitrogen, but it took that long. And the carbon that's associated with compost is often referred to as humus. And the reason why is compost and humus are not the same. Although compost contains these humic compounds, it is not identical to humus, which is very recalcitrant, meaning it hangs around a long time and does not break down quickly. And so this is a very complex molecule that's resistant to decomposition. So it's a great way to store carbon. And remember, we talked about carbon sequestration, but we really are getting people challenging whether humus is even available in the soil over a long time. That a lot of scientists that have been looking at it with new tools are saying we can't find the humus and the fulvic acids in that in the soil because they're being consumed by the life in the soil. And so the life in the soil then becomes really critical, because if we keep feeding the life in the soil, it stores the carbon within the living organism itself. 50% of the carbon that's present in the soil is stored in the form of living organisms. So it's not just compost that's adding carbon. The very living organisms themselves are storing the carbon within their bodies, which will then be released into that soil at some time. Now, compost applications. Remember, we talked about particle size being so critical, how to use compost, particularly for stormwater management. Particle size of compost, fine, medium, and coarse, or a combination, comes in all shapes and sizes. For mulch, broadcast or site-specific can be fine to coarse, and it can be a blend. Both are called mulches. Soil incorporation, typically your fine particle size. You want it to release as quickly as possible, a lot of surface area. Seed top dressing, very fine particle size. You don't want big chunks on top of, covering it too much. You want the fine material to absorb the water and feed the developing germinating seed. Side dressing, fine particle side along row crops, things like that, or shrubs. Custom soil blends, fine particle size. For example, in bioswales, they'll usually add it 1% to a bioswale to hold the moisture as well as hold the nutrients. They don't want to provide too much nutrients, so actually fine compost really works well in bioswale design. Compost berms for filtering runoff, coarse. We want it to flow through the coarse compost and not push it down the road. And so it will tend to stay in place and it'll tend to filter much better than the fine material. compost stormwater blanket, fine to coarse, you can use a combination of both. If it's a flat area, you can use 100% fine. And then filter and grow sock applications, putting it in a containment system, again, fine and coarse.
Craig, you have a couple questions in the comment or in the chat that kind of go along with that last slide. Maybe it'd be a good time to address them.
Okay, thank you. Go ahead.
So the first one is, any thoughts on how best to incorporate compost into site soils? I've heard some negatives on tilling it in. So is it better just to apply compost on top of the site soil?
Again, it depends on particle size. And I've seen both coarse and fine incorporated. But typically, boy, that's a great question, because when you hear, and we've heard a lot about farming for capturing carbon through no-till or low-till farming, meaning rather than tilling it in 12 inches or 6 inches, they just leave it on the surface and they disturb the soil as little as possible. Now, that works in some situations, but in other situations, oftentimes, depending on the soil type, how you use these materials really depends on the soil, basic soil, native soil type that you're working with. If it's a heavy clay, you may want to incorporate it in there to open it up a little bit and allow the organic material to aggregate and break down that tight clay soil, along with something like an application of gypsum or calcium sulfate. But the layering of a mulch on the surface is the basis for all no-till or low-till farming, except they usually just use, it's mainly used in agriculture, but I think we're going to start seeing some applications as it relates to erosion control. And the reason why you want to disturb the soil as little as possible once you produce or lay down a layer of compost is because when you disturb it too much, you destroy the hyphae and the mycorrhizal fungi that are growing on the root systems of the plants themselves or on the surface of the compost, meaning it'll take almost 2 months after you've disturbed soil for the fungal population to re-establish and become effective again in terms of its ability to colonize root systems and increase water holding capacity of the soil and nutrient availability. So there's a lot to be said, but it's a real fine art. We haven't really, from the standpoint of stormwater management, really done the research to understand how we best work with soils. But the bottom line with no-till or low-till theory is you always have a cover on the soil, and the less you disturb it, the better, because you really disrupt the fungal dominant population in that soil. So that's a great question. And,
okay. Yeah. Well, here's another one. Is it a misunderstanding that placing compost as erosion control near a drainage area will lead to nutrient loading in the runoff? In fact, there's a follow-up thought from someone else. To add to this, the International BMP database suggests BMPs containing compost export phosphorus in particular. Any recommendations for reducing phosphorus export?
Another great question, and why you need to have a test result for your compost. Remember I said all compost isn't created equal? I would not put a manure-based compost next to a stream, but a landscape-based compost, depending on what my feedstock was and what my test results show, in most cases, not only is not a problem for export of things like phosphorus and that, but more often than not will actually enhance the quality of the stream, the riparian habitat. And that work is borne out by the research that was done by the Soils for Salmon program in the state of Washington, where they literally brought back the salmon population using compost along stream banks, but they understood how to use it. The other thing is quantity and particle size. So the larger the particle size, the less likely it is to release its nutrients. And if it does release them, it'll release them extremely slowly in very, very low amounts. And so it really, if you know how to manage your compost and you understand what's in it, you can easily use it to not only restore, but to enhance riparian areas where there are streams, rivers, what have you. There's a massive amount of research on the topic. If you Google it, you'll find out people that know how to use it. Most of the time you hear the negativity because somebody misused it. They didn't understand some of the principles we're talking about here, and they put the wrong material down. They didn't test it. They maybe put the wrong particle size down, or possibly they just put too doggone much down. So anyway, that would be my answer to that. That it's not only not, it's in a form, most of the nutrients are tied up with the carbon, right? That's the whole basis of this talk, is that carbon's going to slow everything down. It's not like adding soluble synthetic nitrogen to the soil. Compost releases everything it has very, very slowly, depending on a number of factors I've covered. Okay.
That's it.
All right, let me move on. I got a few more slides here, and then we'll open it up to some more questions. Let's see here. Here we go. Just equipment. It's the last mile. We always talk about we're going to collect this stuff, we're going to produce it, and we'll produce it, and the people will come. And they oftentimes don't come because they don't know how to get the material. It costs too much to transport it or to apply it. So there are blower units. They're expensive, but blower trucks are one of the major, easiest way to apply organic mulches, particularly, are really handy. They're small. They can be put behind a little pickup truck. They do a beautiful job. You do have to pay attention to particle size and again, what you're putting in it. But manure spreaders are still very, very handy. We use that to apply all our compost here at our farm, and they can be used, smaller ones. It'll go through, through vineyards and through tight spaces. There's some for turf grass that you can use for top dressing. So there's a lot of equipment out there. Just look it up, and it really is an important topic that we haven't paid enough attention to. We talked about the infrastructure needed to utilize compost. One of them is going to be these spreaders. We're having a workshop next week with Finn on the blower units. We're inviting everyone to come and just see it demonstrated, so landscapers and even the farm community here in San Diego can see how it's used. And then soil incorporation. That was the question earlier. If you're going to incorporate this material, you do not need, unless you've got a major compaction problem with your soil, and you may very well if heavy equipment's on it, you really don't need to incorporate it very deeply, but it can, incorporation equipment can be very, very helpful depending on, again, what you're trying to do, what plants you are trying to support. So it really depends. Here, just I'm going to finalize here and wrap up with just some examples. Here's a stream in north of San Diego in Temecula, where some young children were playing along that stream bank. It collapsed on them, and one of the children actually died from this stream bank collapse. So really important that we pay attention to this level of erosion from storms. And so they came in there, and I introduced them to compost BMPs, and they used some socks with growing media in it. And then they produced their own compost right at the site, and they spread it. They got the Army, not the Army Corps, the California Conservation Corps to help them plant native plants in the sock along the edges. They regraded it. Here's what it looked like after they were done. And this is, you can see the area on this picture on the right. You can see the bank that was not treated on the left. You can see the vegetation and the native plants. We had willow growing in the sock, and all that compost, they just seeded it with natives, and it stabilized that bank. It was just beautiful. This was all in one. It took 1 year to apply it, and the next year, after some heavy rains, it was just a beautiful sight to behold. Here's another case where they actually took socks, filled it with growing media, fine media, and stacked it on top of each other and wrapped it with geogrid and stuck some willows underneath the socks in layers and anchored them in with geogrid to stabilize this very, very severe stream bank collapse. That's what it looked like after the rains came. The willow literally rooted right in the compost wall, retaining wall, and stabilized that entire slope, providing not only great habitat, but phenomenal filter for anything coming along. Here was a compost erosion control blanket I hand applied literally and used some compost socks filled with coarse media at the lilac fire at one of the properties where the little trailer, kind of a mobile home, had burned. And just they rebuilt their little mobile home, and I just went in and just threw a bunch of wildflower seeds on top of the blanket, didn't incorporate it at all, just laid it there 12 months later. And voila, we had some stabilization, very little. A 1-inch layer of compost doesn't take much. 1-inch layer of compost will absorb on the surface of a slope a 1-inch rain event with no runoff. It really is quite effective. So last, just a resource that you will really value if you get into it. By Calorie Cycle, you go to the Calorie Cycle Compost and Mulch use toolbox. It's a reference source for all kinds of ways you can use recycled organics on landscapes, roadways, stormwater management, fire remediation. It's just really a website worth knowing about, and you can mine it all day long for information. It really was well done by Brian Larimore, and it's a real great contribution to stormwater management. So in conclusion, we can and need to do better. And by that, I really mean we need to mimic nature more, and we need to understand the carbon cycle and how it works. And by applying some of the basic principles I just discussed, I'm very confident we will do better. So with that, I'll open up everything to questions.
All right, well, thank you, Craig. None additional ones in the chat, but if anyone wants to unmute themselves and field a question directly to you, they're welcome to do that at this time.
Yeah.
And,
I know some of the information out there may not be as readily available. I'm working with I'm on the educational committee for the Compost Research and Education Foundation for the U.S. And one of the things that came up is we find a lot of students in college who would like to learn about compost and the utilization of it. Even engineering classes where you're looking at the design of green infrastructure for stormwater management. But there are no classes being offered in the use of recycled organics and in the sequestration of carbon so that you have multiple environmental benefits. So we're looking at trying to reach out to various universities. The University of California just hired, and I was on the search committee, a specialist in organic materials management for the Bay Area. The individual's name is Dr. Michael Cohen. His first day on the job is next week, October 2nd. He was a professor for a good number of years from Sonoma State University, and he will be the new specialist on how to handle organic materials. It's a cross-county position housed out of Santa Clara County's office for Alameda County, San Francisco County, that whole Bay Area, Contra Costa. And I think this is the first step in recognizing the role of carbon, how we manage it, how we manage our waste materials to deliver environmental benefits to our landscapes and to manage stormwater. And so I'll be working with Dr. Cohen to introduce him to some of the tools that I've shared with you today. And hopefully we're going to start seeing more training programs, train the trainer, because with every city being required to divert and procure and utilize recycled organics, we need a lot more teachers and practitioners that can inform responsibly the use of carbon and organic material in our environment so we don't end up with problems. I would like to add that when you don't take into consideration some of the things I shared today, you can misuse organic material and carbon and actually create more problems than you solved. So be aware, there is a right way to do this and a wrong way. Not all composts are created equal. And depending on what you're trying to do may require a different type of compost or particle size. You have to consider all those factors. It truly is a discipline that needs to be shared more with the general public so that we start to learn how to handle our recycled organics and handle carbon in the environment, the carbon cycle.
Well, we do have one question. Are you familiar with the U.S. Compost Council seal of testing requirement? And if so, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I had a slide. That gentleman asked that may not have seen the slide, but I had 2 slides on that topic. And yeah, on the seal of testing assurance. And that, again, that goes to not all compost is created equal. Test, don't guess. Know what's in your material. If you're going to use it along a riparian corridor, make sure you're using a compost that's low in nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And particle size is going to also be critical. But there are a lot of engineers that have used compost extremely successfully. All you have to do is go to the Soils for Salmon website online, and they will tell you how effective it was at not only minimizing contamination of their streams, but literally restoring the salmon population in the state of Washington using compost. So we know how to do it. We just need to educate ourselves. And the seal of testing assurance is one way to start.
All right. Another one, a practical question. Okay, so we see the benefits of compost, but how do we actually find a source of compost to use on our project or on our site? What's the best way to find a local source?
Well, obviously the web, Google or whatever search engine you use, just Google or even ask your landscape contractors or your farmers. They'll get it from different sources. Obviously, the closer you are to the source of the compost, the better, because the cost of transporting the material to your site can be very prohibitive. So closer, the better. The Cal Recycle website I mentioned actually has links to all the composters in the state of California. So you can go there and literally get a list. And then there's the ability to actually start your own composting program. So if you're a grower, for example, there's a lot of money available to actually compost your own organic material on your farm, if in fact you're doing that. Then you can use that compost to manage your stormwater runoff on your farm. And there's all kinds of research on how you can do that using some of the links that are on the Cal Recycle compost and mulch utilization website. So, there's a whole subsection just on the use of it in agriculture in general. But stormwater management on farms is a very important issue today, and one that we need to pay more attention to, and we can use compost to solve those problems.
Okay, and one last question. So when you're sourcing compost from landfills, lots of times they're coming from landfills now. We've noticed that lots of times there are trash and other debris in that. Is there some sort of criteria that they have to meet to remove that trash?
Boy, that's a great question. One of the biggest challenges the compost industry is facing today is when they take in particularly food waste, it comes with a lot of trash. And trying to get that trash out is very, very costly. And unfortunately, oftentimes the composters do not spend the money because people don't want to pay the cost of removing it. You have to get it up front at the source of the feedstock. You have to remove it before you do the grinding to produce the compost. Because once you grind the contaminants in there, and all of a sudden, instead of having a plastic bag, you have 10,000 pieces of film plastic scattered through the whole pile, and it's no longer usable. The permit for the state of California allows for 0.5% of contaminants, inert materials, whether it's plastics, bottle caps, what have you. 0.5% by weight. Well, if you've got film plastic, you can still have a lot of film plastic by weight in 0.5%. And so I just say you got to work with your composter. I have gone to composters when I was working for Filtrex and literally had them adjust their screens and what they call air knives and blow some of the plastic out of there so that my material was very, very minimal. Keep in mind that this contamination issue is a real big problem in society because people have not been trained to keep trash out of their organics. And so that falls on the composter themselves to spend the money and introduce the technology, which is very, very expensive to get that plastic back out. Unfortunately, then it also raises the cost of the material. And so in our case, the way we manage it is we don't take any curbside. We don't take anything from the residential market so that we literally monitor everything that's coming in. And if a load is contaminated, we actually tell them to leave and take it somewhere else because we can't use it.
Right.
So it really is all about the composter and working with the composter and creating the demand so that the state hopefully will help subsidize some of this cleaning up. It's almost going to happen because I'll tell you right now, even though 0.5% is allowable, the end users typically, the percent that they want to see is 0.
Yeah. Yeah.
They don't want to see any contamination, and that's very, very hard to achieve right now.
All right. Well, thank you, Craig. Unfortunately, we're out of time, but this has been a great workshop. And thank you to all of you who attended. And if you have any questions, Craig's contact information is right there on the screen. So we'll see you at the next workshop.
Thank you, John. Appreciate it. Thanks all for listening. And my email is there. If you want any advice or direction on where to go to get information on any of the things I've covered, please email me and I'll be glad to send it to you digitally. Okay?
All right.
Have a good one. Bye.